The morning sun was just peeking over the rooftops of Willow Creek, a tidy suburban enclave in Ohio, when I found the letter. It was stuffed in our mailbox, sealed with a wax stamp like some royal decree. I was halfway through my coffee, my golden retriever Max nudging my leg for a walk, when I tore it open. The words hit me like a punch. The shed on your property violates Willow Creek HOA Article 7C, Section 2.1. Remove it within 10 days or face fines and seizure. Signed, Margaret Hensley, President of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I stood there, the paper trembling in my hand, as my wife, Ellen, called from the kitchen, "Tom, you okay?" She was wrestling with our smart speaker, which kept playing disco hits every time she coughed. When I showed her the letter, her toast dropped onto the plate. "They're coming for the shed?" she whispered, her voice tight. "Your dad's shed?" That shed wasn't just wood and nails. It was my father's last project, built with me in the summer of '98 when I was a gangly teenager. We'd hammered every plank, sweated through our flannel shirts, and laughed over his old radio blaring Johnny Cash. Inside were his tools, a jar of mismatched bolts, and a faint smell of motor oil that still made me feel like he was standing beside me. The idea of Margaret Hensley, a woman who once fined a neighbor for unapproved mailbox font, tearing it down felt like a personal attack. Willow Creek was a place of manicured lawns and whispered gossip, where 200 pages of HOA rules governed everything from grass height to Christmas light wattage. We'd had our share of petty fines, $50 for inconsistent mulch, and a warning for a Halloween skeleton deemed too macabre. But this was different. This was war. Ellen and I marched to the HOA meeting that evening, me in my least wrinkled button-down, her with a notebook of talking points. The community center smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy. Margaret sat at a folding table, flanked by her loyal lieutenants, Roger, who'd once tried to ban birdhouses, and Susan, who'd reported a neighbor for aggressive rose bushes. They stared at us like we'd walked in with mud on our shoes. "We're not here to fight," I said, hands raised. "We just want to understand." Margaret tapped her clipboard, her lips a thin line. "Your shed disrupts the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. It's non-compliant with the code. You have 10 days. It's been there for decades," Ellen countered. "It's part of our home. It's not hurting anyone." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes glinting with what I can only describe as HOA zeal. "This is a community of standards, not nostalgia." I wanted to laugh, but the threat of fines thousands of dollars, maybe more, kept my mouth shut. As we left, Ellen squeezed my hand, and a spark of defiance flickered between us. If they wanted the shed, they'd have to work for it. Back home, I stood in the backyard, my hand on the shed's weathered door. The horseshoe my dad had nailed above it glinted in the moonlight. "We're not losing you," I whispered. That's when the plan started to form, a plan so absurd it might just work. I called my neighbor, Frank, a grizzled retiree who owned a tractor and hadn't shaved since the Reagan era. He showed up in a stained ball cap, holding a wrench like it was a scepter. "What's the job, Tom?" he asked, grinning. "We're moving the shed," I said. "Where to?" "I'll figure that out later." His grin widened, like I'd just handed him a winning lottery ticket. We roped in Lisa, a 16-year-old tech whiz from down the street who built drones from scrap parts, and Diane, a former HOA treasurer who'd been ousted for suggesting mailboxes could be blue. Within 48 hours, we had a crew, a codename Operation Free Haven, and a mission: make the shed untouchable. Ellen and Lisa went undercover at the next HOA meeting, posing as concerned residents. Ellen faked a southern drawl, and Lisa called herself Karen while clutching a clipboard. They learned Margaret was planning a surprise inspection in 5 days, not 10. We had to move fast. That night, Frank and I worked under floodlights, jacking up the shed and bolting on wheels from an old camper trailer. It groaned like a wounded beast, and our first test run was a disaster: 3 inches forward, a cracked wheel, and a tilt that nearly crushed my azaleas. Frank yelled, "Abort," like we were in a war movie. I sat on a crate, sweat-soaked and doubting myself, until Ellen brought me iced tea and said, "We're not crazy. We're right." With 3 days left, we refined the plan. When Margaret showed up for her inspection, she'd step inside the shed. We'd keep her there long enough for me to hook up the tractor and haul it across the neighborhood, out of HOA jurisdiction. It was risky, ridiculous, and probably illegal, but it was ours. The night before, I stood in the yard, staring at the shed's tin roof under the stars. Max barked once, then fell silent. I could almost hear my dad's voice. "Take care of it, son. That sheds us." I nodded to the sky. "Let Margaret come. Let the HOA write their fines." I had a tractor, a crew, and a cause. The next morning, Frank handed me a bacon sandwich while I welded a makeshift axle under the shed. "Fuel for the fight," he said, as sparks flew. Lisa had nicknamed the shed Fort Freedom and was sketching flame decals in her notebook. Ellen had turned our dining room into a command center, with charts tracking HOA patrols and neighborhood foot traffic. Diane dug up bylaws, proving the shed predated the HOA's rules. We were ready as you can be when you're about to drag a building down the street. But Margaret wasn't coming alone. She'd announced a neighborhood wellness sweep in 48 hours, bringing the entire HOA board to sniff out violations. If they saw the wheels, we'd be buried in fines. Ellen's next idea was pure genius, a block party dubbed Operation Pig Roast to distract them. "If they're eating ribs and judging pie contests," she said, "they won't notice a shed rolling by." We sent out invites, borrowed tables, and convinced a local news crew to cover community spirit. Lisa rigged a hidden camera inside the shed, streaming to her laptop. Frank wired a motion sensor to play my dad's voice from an old cassette. "Check the oil, Tom. Keep it clean." It was creepy, but it might spook Margaret enough to buy us time. By dawn, our backyard was a festival. Neighbors brought casseroles and lawn chairs. Kids played tag. Frank, in an apron reading Grill Boss, charred a dozen burgers. The smell of barbecue drifted, and half the HOA showed up, lured by free food. Margaret arrived at noon, clipboard in hand, her smile as fake as her highlights. Diane intercepted her, droning on about sidewalk cracks, while Margaret's eyes kept darting to the shed. Then she made her move. She strode to the shed, yanked open the door, and stepped inside. I sprinted over with a plate of cookies, shouting, "Margaret, try these. County Fair winners." She ignored me and shut the door. Lisa hit a button, and my dad's voice boomed. "Check the oil, Tom." Through the camera, we saw Margaret freeze, her face pale as she spun, looking for ghosts. Margaret's scream echoed through the shed's wooden walls, muffled but sharp, like a cat trapped in a cardboard box. Through Lisa's laptop feed, we watched her clutch her clipboard, spinning in the dim light, her eyes wide with panic. "Who's there?" she shouted as my dad's voice looped again. "Check the oil, Tom. Keep it clean." Susan and Roger, ever loyal, rushed to her side, barging into the shed like they were storming a castle. Big mistake. Frank, lurking behind the shed with a carpenter's wedge, jammed the latch shut. "3 in," he whispered, grinning like a kid who'd just pranked his teacher. 0 out. Ellen checked her phone. "We've got 25 minutes before the news crew gets antsy," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. The barbecue was in full swing. Neighbors laughed over lemonade. Kids tossed beanbags, and the smell of smoked brisket kept everyone distracted. I climbed onto the tractor, my hands slick with sweat on the wheel. Frank gave a thumbs up, and I fired up the engine. The rumble shook my bones, and for a moment, I wondered if this was the dumbest thing I'd ever done. Then I thought of my dad, his calloused hands guiding mine as we built that shed, and I pushed the throttle forward. The shed Fort Freedom, as Lisa called it, lurched an inch, then 2. The wheels, scavenged from a rusted trailer, groaned under the weight. Black smoke puffed from the tractor's exhaust, and the whole contraption wobbled like a drunk tightrope walker. Inside, Margaret's shouts grew louder, joined by Roger's nervous muttering and Susan's attempts to pry open a window my dad had nailed shut in '99. The motion sensor kept triggering, and Dad's voice droned on. "Clean tools, clean work." It sounded like a taunt, and I couldn't help but smile. The barbecue crowd didn't notice at first. Ellen was at the refreshment table, microphone in hand, calling out raffle winners with the calm of a seasoned MC. "Next up, a gift card to Murphy's Hardware," she announced, as neighbors clapped. Lisa sat on the porch, her laptop open, one eye on the GoPro feed, the other on a playlist she'd queued up for victory vibes. Frank guided the shed's wheels with hand signals he'd invented on the spot, barking, "Hold. Adjust," even when nothing needed adjusting. Through the camera, Margaret was unraveling. She held her clipboard like a shield, yelling about municipal code violations and structural endangerment. Roger looked seasick, clutching a rake for balance. Susan, still wrestling with the window, muttered something about lawsuits. The shed inched across the backyard, past Ellen's prized hydrangeas, and onto the driveway. Neighbors started to glance over, their chatter fading. A kid dropped his corndog, pointing. "Is that moving?" he asked. I kept my eyes forward, steering the tractor toward the cul-de-sac. The plan was simple: haul the shed to the edge of Willow Creek, where HOA rules didn't apply. It was a legal gray zone, a no-man's land of zoning loopholes Diane had found in the bylaws. If we could get there, the shed was safe. But the sidewalk was uneven, and when the front wheels hit a raised slab, the whole structure shuddered. A screw popped loose, pinging into the grass. The shed tilted, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought it would collapse, crushing my dreams and probably a few petunias. "Keep going," Frank shouted. Or maybe it was, "We're screwed." The engine's roar drowned him out. I chose to hear the first one and ease the throttle. The shed righted itself, creaking but holding. We were halfway down the driveway when the first real trouble arrived. A police cruiser, its lights lazily flashing, rolled up to the curb. Of course, someone probably misses. Larson, who'd once called the cops on a suspicious ice cream truck, had ratted us out. Officer Daniels stepped out, a guy who'd once ticketed me for parking my truck 2 inches over my property line. He surveyed the scene, a shed crawling down the street, a barbecue in full swing, and me on a tractor looking guiltier than a kid with cookie crumbs on his face. He walked over, one hand on his belt, the other shielding his eyes from the sun. I cut the engine, the shed halting with a groan. "Morning, Tom," he said, his tone more tired than angry. "Care to explain?" "Morning, officer," I said, forcing a smile. "Just relocating a structure for temporary maintenance. All above board." He glanced at the shed, which vibrated as Margaret pounded on the walls. "Is that Margaret Hensley in there?" "Yes, sir." "And you're moving her?" "Technically." She walked involuntarily. He raised an eyebrow, then rubbed his chin. To my shock, he sighed and said, "I'm grabbing a lemonade." I didn't see anything for the next 10 minutes. "Deal." "Deal." I nodded, barely believing my luck. Daniel strolled toward the drink table, and Frank whispered, "We're charmed, man." Charmed. I restarted the tractor, and the shed rolled onto the street. Neighbors clapped, some tossing confetti from a kid's birthday stash. Max barked like he was leading a parade. Every foot felt like a victory, but Margaret wasn't done. Her voice pierced the wood. "This is kidnapping. I'll sue you into oblivion." Her stilettos thumped against the walls, a rhythm of fury. Lisa cranked external speakers, blasting Sweet Home Alabama to drown her out. It wasn't patriotic, but it felt right. Then Diane sprinted up, her face pale. "Trouble," she said, holding her phone. "Channel 5's here. Margaret called them this morning for a property value story. They're filming." Sure enough, a news van parked at the corner. A reporter, young and eager, jumped out with a camera guy, his lens trained on the shed. An intern clutched a microphone, gaping like he'd stumbled into a circus. "Can you stall them?" I asked Diane. "Not stall," she said. "Redirect." She marched over and launched into a tale of HOA overreach, trespassing, and homeowner rights. The reporter's eyes lit up, sensing a scoop. The camera stayed on the shed, now a trembling monument to defiance. I turned the tractor onto a side road, the pavement rougher but free of HOA control. The sun broke through the clouds, and a sparrow perched briefly on the shed's roof, like nature was cheering us on. Then the latch broke. The door flew open, and Margaret burst out like a tornado in a blazer, her hair wild, her blouse crumpled. Susan and Roger stumbled after, looking like they'd been through a blender. Margaret pointed at me, her voice a banshee wail. "You'll pay for this. This is a federal crime." "Pretty sure it's not," I said, keeping calm. She spun to the reporter, realizing the camera was rolling. She tried to spin it as a hostage crisis, but Lisa's footage of her entering the shed willingly killed her narrative. Susan retched into a bush. Roger sat on the curb, Googling how to resign from an HOA. The shed hissed to a stop at the edge of town, its wheels caked in mud. I climbed down, legs shaky but heart soaring. Ellen ran up, hugging me so tight I couldn't breathe. Frank high-fived me, nearly dislocating my shoulder. The news crew swarmed, asking questions we barely answered. The story was already alive. A man, a shed, a tractor, and a neighborhood that said no to petty tyranny. We'd won the battle, but the war wasn't over. Margaret's glare promised retribution, and the HOA wasn't known for backing down. That night, we sat in the backyard, the shed parked like a trophy. Ellen leaned against me, her hand warm in mine. Lisa replayed the GoPro footage, cackling at Margaret's meltdown. Frank cracked a beer, toasting Fort Freedom. Max curled at my feet, oblivious to the chaos. I looked at the shed, its tin roof glinting under the stars, and felt my dad's presence. We kept it safe, for now. But tomorrow, the HOA would strike back. The next morning, Willow Creek woke to a strange calm, like the hush before a thunderstorm. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching dew glisten on the shed. Fort Freedom now parked at the edge of our cul-de-sac like a battle-scarred monument. Its door hung slightly ajar from Margaret's dramatic escape, and a pair of robins perched on the roof, unbothered by the chaos it had caused. Max scratched at the screen door, eager for his walk, while Ellen shuffled downstairs in her robe, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She joined me at the window, sipping her coffee, and we stared at the shed in silence. It wasn't just a shed anymore. It was a symbol, a line in the sand. And we both knew the fight wasn't over. By 10 a.m., the HOA's response arrived, an email blast titled Emergency Community Debrief. It summoned every resident to the clubhouse that evening to discuss homeowner accountability, conduct violations, and disciplinary measures. The language dripped with bureaucratic venom, and Frank, who'd stopped by to drop off a bag of donuts, read it aloud in a mock-serious tone. Disciplinary pathways? He snorted, adjusting his ball cap. Sounds like they're planning a witch hunt. I couldn't disagree. Margaret Hensley wasn't the type to slink away quietly, and this meeting was her counterattack. Diane called an hour later with intel. Margaret had spent the night firing off emails to lawyers, the mayor's office, and even the county zoning board, trying to label our shed a nuisance structure and demand its immediate removal. She'd also left a rambling voicemail with the local insurance office, asking if hostile architecture was covered under liability clauses. She's unhinged, Diane said, her voice a mix of amusement and concern. But she's got connections. We need to be ready. Ellen was already on it. She'd spent the morning printing every HOA bylaw, marking sections Margaret had violated with neon highlighters. She taped photos from Lisa's GoPro footage to a poster board, each one timestamped to show Margaret's unauthorized entry into the shed. Diane drafted a formal complaint, accusing Margaret of trespassing, harassment, and abuse of power. Lisa, meanwhile, had turned her footage into a 4-minute video masterpiece titled Shed Wars, The Rebellion. With dramatic music and slow-motion shots of Margaret's meltdown, it hit 5,000 views on YouTube by noon. We're viral. Lisa grinned, her fingers flying over her laptop. Frank contributed a spreadsheet, something about noise ordinances and food truck permits that looked impressive even if I didn't understand it. Numbers scare bureaucrats, he said, winking. Our plan was clear. Hit the HOA with facts, footage, and community support. If Margaret wanted a fight, we'd bring an arsenal. The clubhouse that evening was packed, every folding chair taken, with latecomers leaning against walls or hovering near the snack table, pretending to inspect the cheese platter. The air buzzed with tension, but also curiosity. Not everyone was on our side. Some neighbors clung to the HOA's rules like a life raft, but others were fed up with Margaret's reign. I caught nods from folks who'd gotten their own HOA fines for nonsense like unapproved garden gnomes or excessive porch pumpkins. Margaret sat at the head table, her blouse starched, her pearls gleaming like tiny bullets. Roger and Susan flanked her, both looking like they'd rather be at a tax audit. Margaret banged a gavel with enough force to crack the table. This meeting will come to order, she snapped, her voice tight. No one clapped. She launched into a speech about community values, mutual respect, and the sacred duty of uniformity. But her composure cracked, her voice quavered, and her eyes darted to me every few seconds, like I was a ticking bomb. When she called our shed's journey reckless endangerment and an assault on HOA dignity, someone in the back coughed, loud and suspiciously like a laugh. Margaret's glare could have melted steel. Then it was my turn. I stood, No notes, just the truth. I told them about the shed, how my dad and I built it when I was 17, how its creaky planks held memories of late-night talks and shared beers. I told them it predated the HOA, that it wasn't hurting anyone, and that Margaret's obsession with aesthetic harmony was a flimsy excuse to erase our history. Then I nodded to Lisa. She hooked her laptop to the projector, and the room darkened. Shed Wars played in glorious detail. Margaret storming into the shed, her screams as my dad's voice echoed, her frantic threats as the shed rolled down the street. The music swelled, and a slow-motion shot of her hair flying wild drew gasps and a few stifled laughs. When the screen went black, half the room erupted in applause. The other half just stared, torn between shock and admiration. Margaret shot to her feet, her face crimson. "This is character assassination," she shrieked, pointing at me. Diane stood, arms crossed. "No, it's accountability," she said coolly. Then Roger, of all people, leaned into his mic and muttered, "I move to vote on Margaret's resignation as HOA president." The room froze. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret stammered, her gavel trembling in her hand. "This is a vendetta," she cried, but the damage was done. A vote was called. Hands rose, voices rang out ayes, nays, a few abstentions. One guy's yay was so loud it triggered mic feedback, earning a snort from the back. When the tally came, Margaret was out, 42-18. She didn't take it well. She stormed out, tripping over a slow cooker near the door. Her pearl necklace snapped, beads scattering like tiny surrender across the floor. The silence that followed was electric, heavy with victory and disbelief. Diane was named interim president on the spot. Her first act was to suspend all fines and inspections pending a rulebook overhaul. Her second was to propose an amendment nicknamed the Walton Clause, exempting historical structures of personal significance, like our shed. The room clapped again, louder this time. We walked home under a warm night sky, Ellen's hand in mine, Frank carrying a Tupperware of leftover brownies. Lisa skipped ahead, narrating the night like a sportscaster. Max trotted beside us, his tie slightly askew. Back home, the shed sat quietly, its wheels still caked in dirt. We didn't move it back, yet there was time for that. For now, we were exhausted, proud, and a little stunned. We'd toppled a tyrant, but the bigger fight loomed, the city hearing. Margaret wasn't done, and her allies in the HOA's parent organization were circling. The shed's fate and ours hung in the balance. The hearing was set for the following week at the City Hall Annex, a squat brick building that smelled of copier toner and old carpet. The crowd was bigger than I'd expected, a mix of neighbors, some still in gardening gloves, others dressed like they were pitching a business deal. One guy wore a suit jacket with cargo shorts, like he couldn't decide between a boardroom or a barbecue. The energy was electric, not angry but alive. As if people sensed this was about more than a shed, it was about whether rules could crush memories. We sat in the third row, me, Ellen, Frank, Lisa, Diane, and Max, who Ellen insisted was our emotional support witness. He wore his tie and sat primly, earning smiles from strangers. The HOA's remnants sat up front, looking like shipwreck survivors. Margaret was absent, reportedly on personal leave, which we all knew meant she was raging in private, probably yelling at her hydrangeas. Diane, as interim president, had requested a review of Margaret's recent citations, especially the seizure attempt, turning it into a public debate. The city clerk, a gray-haired woman with a no-nonsense stare, presided, flanked by two board members who looked half asleep. We opened with Lisa's new video, a calm timeline of events backed by GoPro clips, security footage, and a statement from Mrs. Callahan, who said she hadn't laughed that hard since Woodstock. The clerk watched, her eyes narrowing when Margaret was shown entering the shed uninvited, then screaming about illegal transport while being legally towed. Frank took the mic first, explaining the shed's mobility in a rambling mix of technical jargon and farm metaphors. He called it non-permanent migratory architecture, which made the clerk blink twice and jot a note. Then I stood. I didn't plan a speech, just spoke from the heart. I told them how my dad taught me to swing a hammer in that shed, how we'd sit inside during thunderstorms, listening to rain on the tin roof. I told them it wasn't just Woodit was alive with our story. and I told them how the HOA tried to erase it with a form letter. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like everyone's holding their breath. The clerk leaned forward, her voice softer than I expected. Do you have proof that the shed predated the HOA? Ellen handed her a photo from '99. Me and Dad in front of the shed, paint cans at our feet, grinning in matching flannels. The clerk nodded. That'll do. Then came the curveball. A man in a beige suit stood, introducing himself as legal counsel for the HOA's regional management group. Margaret had escalated the case, trying to pull it out of local control. He rattled off codes and policies, calling the shed a nuisance entity, and our actions visual rebellion. I laughed at Callan help it and half the room joined me. He pressed on, citing subsections until Diane stood and calmly dismantled his argument, pointing out that pre-HOA structures were exempt, especially ones moved for maintenance. Lisa delivered the knockout. She held up a binder, color-coded and thicker than a phone book, detailing Margaret's selective enforcement, ignored complaints, and contradictory emails, all obtained via public records. She capped it with a petition signed by 130 neighbors that morning, demanding Margaret's permanent removal from the HOA rolls. The clerk's eyebrows shot up. The lawyer sat down, deflated. The City Hall annex felt like a pressure cooker as the clerk called for final comments. I glanced at Ellen, her hand squeezing mine under the table, her eyes steady despite the weight of the moment. Frank leaned forward, looking like he wanted to say something profound but couldn't find the words. Lisa smirked, her binder still open on her lap, a quiet confidence radiating from her. Diane adjusted her glasses, ready to jump in if needed. Max, our tie-wearing emotional support dog, yawned and stretched, oblivious to the stakes. The crowd neighbors, gardeners, even the guy in the suit and shorts combo leaned in, waiting for the hammer to fall. I stood one last time, my voice quieter than before but firm. I'm not asking for a trophy or a payout, I said. I just want us to stop treating people's lives like checkboxes on a form. That shed's part of my family's story. If a neighborhood can't make room for that, we're missing the point of community. It wasn't a speech, just the raw truth, and it hung in the air like a challenge. The clerk nodded, her face unreadable, and adjourned the hearing. We'll issue a ruling in 48 hours, she said, banging her gavel. The room exhaled, a mix of relief and restless anticipation. As we filed out, neighbors clapped me on the back, some whispering, "Good for you," or "Never liked her anyway." Mrs. Callahan, who'd given her Woodstock quote for our video, hugged Ellen and said, "You've got guts, honey." Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Max chased a squirrel, his tie flapping. Frank claimed dibs on celebratory pie at the diner. Diane pulled Ellen aside, whispering that the HOA board was drafting an exemption for the shed, possibly naming it a neighborhood heritage asset. Lisa, ever the visionary, suggested turning it into a mobile tech lab. Frank countered with a barbecue shack. Ellen just smiled and said, "Let's give it a breather." Back home, we didn't touch the shed. It sat at the cul-de-sac's edge, a stubborn sentinel under the stars. We were too tired to move it, too wired to sleep. Ellen and I sat on the porch, sharing a beer, while Lisa uploaded her hearing footage to YouTube, titled Shed Wars, The Reckoning. Frank sprawled on a lawn chair, regaling us with tales of his tractor's glory days. Max snored at our feet. The quiet felt fragile, like the world was holding its breath. The ruling came 2 days later, delivered by email, certified mail, and oddly a hand-delivered copy from Roger, who looked like he'd aged a decade since the shed's road trip. He smelled of toner and regret, mumbling, "Just doing my job," before shuffling off. The clerk's decision was clear. The shed, built before the HOA's formation, was exempt from retroactive enforcement. Margaret's attempt to seize it was improper, and all related fines were voided. The kicker? The shed was officially designated a structure of personal historical significance, a title that made it untouchable. Fort Freedom was no longer just our sit was Willow Creek's. We gathered neighbors for an impromptu celebration in our backyard. Diane read the ruling aloud, her voice cracking with pride when she reached the part calling our actions an unorthodox but non-malicious act of community resistance. Lisa nearly choked on her soda, laughing. Frank slapped my shoulder, declaring, You're a legend, Tom, like it or not. Max barked, tail wagging, as if he'd masterminded the whole thing. Ellen raised a glass of lemonade, toasting to stubborn sheds and stubborn people. The cheers were loud enough to rattle the windows. Not everyone was thrilled. Margaret, we learned, had left town, citing stress and reputational damage. Rumor had it she'd taken a job at a Florida HOA, where she was already trying to ban flamingo lawn ornaments. A week later, a cryptic envelope arrived in our mailbox with no return address. Inside, a single typed note. We noticed your shed. Let's avoid a repeat. Ellen framed it and hung it above the coffee pot. Our badge of honor, she said, grinning. With Margaret gone, the HOA held a special election. Diane was voted permanent president, winning 95% of the vote, save for one neighbor who voted for himself and then cried foul when he lost. Diane's first move was to gut the rulebook, slashing clauses about mulch shades and holiday light timers. She introduced a common-sense clause: don't be a jerk and don't waste our time unless someone's house is on fire. The crowd at the meeting roared with approval, a sound I hadn't heard in Willow Creek before. Diane offered me the vice president role, but I passed. I'd had enough of HOA politics, even the reformed kind. Instead, I pitched a new idea. The Willow Creek Fixers, a volunteer group to help neighbors with home repairs, leaky faucets, wobbly fences, no fines or forms required. Frank signed up as chief morale officer. Lisa designed a logo with a hammer and a Wi-Fi signal, and Max got a bandana with the emblem. The Fixers caught on fast, with folks calling us for everything from stuck windows to broken porch swings. It wasn't just about repairs, it was about rebuilding trust. The shed became a local legend. Neighbors stopped by to snap photos, kids drew it in chalk on driveways, and a tourism board member half-jokingly suggested adding it to the town's historical tour. We declined, but let a college student film a documentary, Shed of Defiance, a suburban saga, which won a prize at a local film fest. Frank swore he didn't cry watching it, but his eyes were suspiciously shiny. That summer, we threw a block party to honor the shed. Ellen cooked enough chili to feed a small army. Lisa projected a slideshow of our saga photos, clips, even a blooper reel of Frank whacking himself with a shovel during our first tractor test. Neighbors danced to a playlist Lisa curated, the shed glowing under strings of soft white lights. It looked settled, proud, like it knew its place in the world. As the night wound down, I sat on the porch steps with Ellen, Max curled at our feet. Neighbors waved as they left, their laughter fading into the warm night. I thought of my dad, imagining him in his old chair inside the shed, sipping coffee, grumbling about rusty nails. He'd be proud, not just because we saved his shed, but because we'd done it without losing who we were. Ellen rested her head on my shoulder and said, "This'll be one of those stories people tell for years, won't it?" I nodded. Let them tell it. Maybe it'll remind someone else to stand up, even for something as simple as a pile of wood. The shed stood behind us, quiet and unmoving, the anchor it had always been. We hadn't just saved a building. We'd carved out a piece of home, a reminder that rules should lift people, not tear them down. Willow Creek felt different now, flawed, funny, but finally like a community. The rain came softly and steadily the morning after the ruling, tapping gently on the tin roof of the shed. Fort Freedom now back in its original spot in our backyard. Ellen and I sat on the porch, coffee mugs warming our hands, watching droplets slide off the shed's weathered planks. It looked like it had never moved, rooted to the earth as if the whole saga had been a fever dream. But the mud-caked wheels, tucked beneath its frame, told a different story. So did the frame note above our coffee maker, Margaret's cryptic warning, "We noticed your shed. Let's avoid a repeat." The rain felt cleansing, like the sky was washing away the last traces of conflict, leaving Willow Creek quieter, humbler, and maybe a little wiser. Ellen glanced at me, her eyes crinkling with a tired smile. "So, we won," she said, half laughing, like she still couldn't believe it. "Looks like it," I replied, clinking my mug against hers. The victory was official, sealed in the city clerk's ruling and echoed in the cheers of our neighbors. The shed was untouchable, a structure of personal historical significance, a phrase that made Frank chuckle every time he repeated it. But the win was bigger than wood, and Nailsit was about proving that a community could stand up to petty tyranny and come out stronger. The weeks that followed were a blur of rebuilding. Diane, now the HOA's permanent president, wasted no time reshaping Willow Creek's rules. She held open forums where neighbors could voice their gripes, from fines for unapproved flower pots to bans on backyard swings. One guy, still bitter about a $100 penalty for a non-compliant bird feeder, brought a PowerPoint to make his case. Diane listened, nodded, and by the next meeting, half the rulebook was gone, replaced with her common sense clause. Don't be a jerk, and don't bother us unless it's serious. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair, and that was enough. The Willow Creek Fixers, our volunteer repair crew, became a quiet force in the neighborhood. Frank led with his trademark chaos, showing up to jobs with a toolbox and a thermos of questionable coffee. Lisa, our tech prodigy, rigged a group chat to coordinate requests and designed a website with a tagline: "Fixing fences, building bonds." Max, sporting his branded bandana, tagged along, charming homeowners while we patched roofs or oiled squeaky gates. One widow, Mrs. Harper, called us to fix her porch steps and ended up baking us cookies every week, calling it payment. The fixers weren't just about hammers and nails. They were about reminding people they weren't alone. The shed, meanwhile, grew into something of a local myth. Kids biked by to gawk, whispering that it was the shed that fought the HOA. A group of teens painted it on a mural at the community center, complete with cartoon flames and a tractor. A history teacher from the high school asked if she could bring her class to see it, calling it a case study in grassroots resistance. We said yes, mostly because Lisa thought it was hilarious. The kids stood in our backyard, snapping photos while I told them about my dad, the shed's creaky soul, and how a bunch of neighbors turned a pile of wood into a cause. One boy, shy but curious, asked, "Did you ever think you'd lose?" I smiled. Every day? But we didn't. Ellen and I started spending more time in the shed, not just to tinker, but to sit, listen to the radio, and let the memories settle. I found an old wrench my dad had etched with his initials, tucked behind a crate. Holding it felt like shaking his hand again. Ellen hung a photo on the wall, the one from '99, me and Dad grinning in front of the shed, paint splattered and proud. "He'd love this," she said, her voice soft. I nodded, too choked up to answer. Margaret's absence left a void, but not the kind anyone mourned. Word trickled in that she was stirring trouble at her new HOA in Florida, trying to outlaw wind chimes and excessive palm trees. A neighbor who followed her on social media showed us a post where she ranted about suburban anarchy, clearly aimed at us. We laughed, but it was a reminder. The fight for fairness never really ends. There'd always be another Margaret, another rulebook swung like a club. But Willow Creek was ready now, armed with a new sense of unity. The block party we threw that summer was the shed's true victory lap. Ellen turned our backyard into a festival, with tables groaning under trays of her famous cornbread and pulled pork. Lisa set up a projector, screening a montage of our saga-grainy GoPro clips, news footage, even a shaky video of Frank cursing as he dropped a wrench during our first tractor test. Neighbors roared with laughter, clapping when the screen showed Margaret's pearl necklace scattering across the clubhouse floor. Kids ran wild, playing tag around the shed, which glowed under strings of Edison bulbs. It wasn't flashy, just warm, like the heart of the neighborhood had finally found its rhythm. As the party wound down, Ellen and I sat on the shed steps, Max sprawled at our feet. Fireflies blinked in the dusk, and the last neighbors waved as they headed home, their voices fading into the cricket hum. I thought of my dad, his low chuckle, his insistence that good would hold stories. He'd built the shed to last, but he couldn't have known it would carry us this far. Ellen leaned against me, her voice barely a whisper. "We didn't just save the shed, did we?" "No," I said. "We saved something bigger." The shed stood behind us, stubborn and still, its tin roof catching the moonlight. It was more than a landmark. No, it was proof that the smallest things, fought for with heart, could change everything. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was ours, a place where rules served people, not the other way around. The fight had cost us sleepless nights and a few gray hairs, but it gave us back our home, our neighbors, and a story we'd tell for years. Months later, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a tiny wooden shed model, hand-carved, with a note, "To Fort Freedom," from an admirer. We set it on the mantel, a quiet nod to the strangers our story had reached. Lisa's videos kept racking up views, sparking comments from people across the country who'd battled their HOAs or fought for their peace of home. "You gave me hope," one wrote. "Keep swinging," said another. It wasn't fame, but it was enough. The shed stayed where it was, creaky and crooked, a daily reminder of what we'd done. Ellen and I walked Max past it every morning, sometimes stopping to touch its weathered planks, to feel the weight of memory and triumph. The fixers grew, the HOA stayed fair, and Willow Creek settled into a new normal one where neighbors waved a little warmer, where rules bent toward kindness. We'd won, not just for us, but for anyone who'd ever felt a faceless system try to erase what mattered most. Thank you for joining Tom, Ellen, and the Willow Creek crew in their fight for Fort Freedom. This story isn't just about a shed, it's about standing up to injustice, protecting what's yours, and finding strength in community. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a power-hungry HOA, a bullying boss, or a system that felt rigged? How did you fight back? Do you think Tom's tractor rebellion went too far, or was it justified? Share your stories, take a stand, and let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters, let it be heard.